Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an incredible story. Get ready for an intense ride as we dive deep into a mysterious case that has been puzzling minds for years. Today's story will keep you on the edge of your seat. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. It was a cold autumn evening in Grimwood, a small town hidden beneath the towering trees of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog rolled in like a thick blanket smothering the streets and casting a somber shadow over the town. The yellow streetlights flickered against the misty air, illuminating the old brick buildings that lined the narrow cobblestone streets. It was the kind of town where the past never really left. The history of unsolved mysteries lingered in the corners of every quiet alley and creaked through every abandoned house. Grimwood had seen its fair share of disappearances, mysterious, unsettling, and no one ever seemed to talk about them. But tonight something would happen that no one in this sleepy town would forget. Andrew Hayes, a 34-year-old marketing executive, had been living in Grimwood for almost a decade. He was normal by all accounts. He was the kind of person you'd pass on the street and never give a second glance. He worked at the local marketing firm, had a wife he loved, and a small circle of friends. But underneath that seemingly normal life, there were secrets. Secrets Andrew had been carrying for years. Secrets that no one knew, not even his wife, Emily Hayes. It was a Thursday, just like any other. Andrew had worked late at the office, preparing for a meeting that had been scheduled for the next day. But at 7 p.m., he called it a night. He had made plans to meet some friends for dinner, something to unwind after a long week of work. Jake Miller, his best friend from college, was waiting for him at the restaurant. They had been talking about this dinner for days. It was supposed to be nothing more than catching up, sharing a meal, and reminiscing about their time together. But Andrew never showed up. Jake waited, tapping his fingers on the table, wondering if Andrew was running late. A glass of water sat untouched in front of him. He checked his phone. There was no message, no call. The minutes turned into an hour. Still nothing. It wasn't like Andrew to just not show up. So Jake called him. The phone rang a few times before it went to voicemail. Strange, Jake thought. After a few more calls with no answer, Jake drove over to Andrew's house. He knocked on the door. No response. He tried calling again, but it went straight to voicemail. Jake was getting worried. He knew that Andrew wouldn't leave without at least telling someone where he was going. Meanwhile, at Emily Hayes' house, things were already starting to feel off. She had arrived home late that night, expecting to find her husband settled in, relaxing after his long day. But the house was strangely quiet. It didn't feel like Andrew. He wasn't in the kitchen or the living room where he would usually be. She stepped into the hallway looking toward the bedroom, but it was empty. "Andrew," she called softly, a hint of concern creeping into her voice. She checked the bathroom, the study, the guest room. Nothing. She walked into the kitchen, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors, and there it was, the familiar empty coffee mug Andrew always left beside the sink. But the strange thing was that his keys, his wallet, and his phone were all gone, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Emily's chest tightened. Something wasn't right. She immediately called out for him again, walking through the rooms faster now, starting to panic. Her eyes glanced toward the front door, and that's when she saw it. The car. Andrew's car was parked outside as if he had just arrived. But the car door was slightly ajar. That didn't make sense. Why would Andrew leave the door open like that? She walked toward the car, her heart racing. She glanced inside. The briefcase was on the passenger seat, just where Andrew had left it. But there were no signs of any struggle, no blood, no signs that anything was wrong. Still, she felt a growing sense of dread. It was the way the door had been left open, almost as though he had intended to go inside but never made it. She quickly went back inside, dialing Andrew's phone one more time. No answer. The unease that had been settling in her chest grew stronger. She called the police. The police arrived quickly. The crime scene investigators combed through the house, the car, and the surrounding areas. They questioned Emily, trying to get a sense of when Andrew had last been seen, whether he had any enemies or any reason to leave without warning. Emily explained that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No signs of forced entry, no threatening letters, no strange behavior. The officers checked the security footage from nearby cameras, hoping for some clue as to where Andrew had gone. There, in the footage from a local coffee shop, they saw Andrew walking down the street around 8 p.m., just as he had planned. He appeared calm, walking alone. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the footage abruptly cuts off as he turns a corner, disappearing into the shadows of a dark alley. The investigation intensified. Officers scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions, but no one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything. The town, as usual, was quiet. Too quiet. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion and fear. Andrew had simply vanished. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigator, was called in to lead the case. She had handled her fair share of unsolved disappearances, but something about this case felt different. The silence in the air, the feeling that something was being hidden, gnawed at her as she walked through the scene. She started with Emily. Sarah Mitchell, looking at Emily, speaking calmly. "Where do you think he could be?" Emily, shaking her head. I don't know. It's not like him. He wouldn't leave without telling me, not like this." Mitchell watched Emily carefully. The woman appeared distraught, but her story was consistent. Nothing about her seemed off, though Sarah couldn't help but feel like there was more to the situation. There always was. Emily had no idea where Andrew had gone or why. And as the hours passed, the police began to uncover something they hadn't expected. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of abduction, but the fact that Andrew had left without a trace left the investigators with more questions than answers. The investigation stretched on through the night. The police searched the streets and the abandoned buildings, but nothing. No sign of Andrew. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing up the town. Detective Mitchell stood in front of Andrew's office building, looking out at the street where Andrew had been last seen. She turned, walking into the alley where the security footage ended. The alley was dark, narrow, and seemed to swallow the light from the street lamps. There are some things you just don't know about the people closest to you, things buried deep beneath the surface, hidden from the world. And when someone disappears, those secrets come to light in ways you never imagined. Andrew Hayes seemed like an ordinary man, or at least that's how most of Grimwood saw him. He had a solid career as a marketing executive, a wife who adored him, and a house that felt like home. He fit perfectly into the small, tight-knit community of Grimwood, a town known for its quiet streets, crumbling buildings, and unsolved mysteries. On the outside, Andrew's life seemed almost picture-perfect, but beneath that ordinary exterior was a past so dark it could have been ripped from the pages of a crime novel. He had always been a man of few words. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Andrew had managed to keep his personal life remarkably private. But it wasn't just privacy. It was secrecy. There were things about Andrew Hayes that no one knew. Things his wife, Emily, never suspected. And now, as the investigation into his disappearance unfolded, those secrets were starting to surface, one by one. Andrew's past. Andrew was born in a town far from Grimwood, a place that smelled of desperation and decay, with dark corners that even the bravest of souls avoided. He had grown up in a house filled with shouting and violence, a house that wasn't safe, not even for a child. His father had been a heavy drinker, abusive when the bottle ran dry. And his mother? Well, she was silent, fading away behind the walls of their crumbling home, offering little comfort to the boy who spent most of his days alone, hiding from the storms that raged inside the house. At the age of 18, Andrew left that life behind. The decision wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. There was no future for him there. He packed his few belongings into a duffel bag, walked out the door, and never looked back. He moved to a new city, changed his name, and buried his past as deep as he could. It was a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the memories of the man who'd raised him and the woman who never protected him. For years, he managed to stay in the shadows, building a new identity, a new life, and even a new set of friends. But the thing about hiding is that you can only do it for so long before the past starts to claw its way back. And that's exactly what happened when Andrew moved to Grimwood. Emily Hayes and their life together. When Andrew met Emily, he thought he'd found peace, a sense of stability he'd never known before. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, and most importantly, she was different from the women in his past. She didn't ask questions. She didn't probe into his past. She accepted him for who he was, and for a while that was enough. They married, settled into a small house on the edge of Grimwood, and built a life that seemed perfect on the surface. But as the years passed, something began to shift. Andrew's past wasn't just something he'd buried. It was something that haunted him, lurking in the back of his mind, waiting to surface. His anxiety grew worse. He became more withdrawn, more distant, especially in the last few months before his disappearance. Emily noticed the change, of course. How could she not? The man she married seemed to be slipping away piece by piece, until all that was left was a shadow, a man who no longer recognized himself. There were days when Andrew would sit in their living room staring out the window, lost in thought. Other times he would be irritable, snapping at Emily over nothing. It was almost as though he were waiting for something, waiting for a past he couldn't escape to finally catch up with him. But Emily never pressed. She loved him, and she believed that whatever was troubling him would eventually pass. She didn't know the truth. She couldn't have. She didn't know that the man she had married was not the same man who had once run away from a past so dark, so dangerous, that it would eventually catch up with him. Jake Miller, the college friend. And then there was Jake Miller. Jake had been Andrew's college roommate, and over the years they had stayed in touch, though not as much as they used to. Jake was the type of friend you could rely on for anything, a good listener, the kind of person who would drop everything to help you. Jake had always known there was something different about Andrew, even back in college. There were days when Andrew seemed like a completely different person, quiet, distant, and sometimes unpredictable. But Andrew never talked about his past. He never talked about his family, his childhood, or anything that might explain the haunted look that often crossed his face. Jake tried to stay in touch after college, but as time passed, their relationship became strained. Andrew grew more distant, more withdrawn. But Jake never stopped thinking about his old friend, even if Andrew had stopped reaching out. Jake didn't know what was really going on. He couldn't have known, but he knew something wasn't right. In the days before Andrew disappeared, Jake tried to reach him a few times. They had talked briefly, but Andrew's voice had sounded off, almost like he was distracted by something. But Jake didn't think much of it at the time. It was only later, after Andrew vanished, that Jake began to feel a sickening unease. Strange behavior and mysterious events. Andrew had been acting differently in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Emily noticed it, his colleagues noticed it, and even Jake had picked up on the subtle shifts in his behavior. There were nights when Andrew couldn't sleep, when he'd pace around the house, his hands trembling as if he were waiting for something to happen. He checked the locks on the doors more often, always peering out the windows as if he were expecting someone. The strangest part, though, was the cryptic phone calls. Calls that Andrew never told Emily about, calls that he would hang up quickly, only to seem even more anxious after. Emily had always thought it was just stress from work. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Andrew had begun to withdraw from her emotionally, becoming more and more consumed by thoughts that he refused to share. Andrew's secrets and unspoken fears. As the investigation progressed, Sarah Mitchell uncovered a detail that sent chills down her spine. Andrew had been contacted by someone from his past, someone he had been running from for years. It was a name Mitchell hadn't expected to find: Tom Granger. Tom Granger had been a fugitive involved in a series of unsolved murders years ago. He had vanished before Andrew moved to Grimwood, and his case had remained cold for a long time. But Andrew and Granger's connection was not something anyone had expected. Mitchell learned that Andrew had known Granger when he was younger. In fact, they had been involved in criminal activities together in their youth. Andrew's involvement in those dark deeds was something he had tried to forget, but the past had a way of coming back. It was around 10 p.m. when Emily Hayes returned home that fateful evening. The town of Grimwood was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The fog had begun to roll in thicker than usual, swallowing the streets whole as if nature itself were trying to obscure the truth. Emily had no idea that by the time she'd set foot inside her home, her life, and the lives of those around her, would be shattered forever. She entered the house with a soft sigh, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The warmth of the house, the familiar smell of her husband's aftershave in the air, all felt strangely comforting. But something was off. The quiet that greeted her when she stepped inside wasn't normal. It wasn't the calm, end-of-day silence she'd grown accustomed to. It was more like the silence that comes before something terrible happens. That pressing quiet that drowns out any hint of peace. "Andrew," she called out, her voice a little too loud in the stillness. Her eyes swept across the room, instinctively searching for him. He wasn't in the living room, the kitchen, or the study. The house felt empty, too empty. It wasn't like Andrew to be so silent when she came home. They had a routine, a pattern to the evenings. She'd walk in, he'd be sitting on the couch, and they'd chat about their day. She expected that tonight just like every other night. But tonight was different. Andrew was missing. Her heart began to pound. Emily moved quickly through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She checked the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom, each room colder than the last. No sign of Andrew, no sign of his familiar presence. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as her chest tightened with anxiety. The front door was locked, just as she'd left it, but something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. Something wasn't right. Andrew never left without a word. He would never just vanish like this. The next place she checked was the garage, his car. It had to be there. He couldn't have gone far. But when she opened the door to the garage, she was struck by the oddness of the sight before her. His car was parked in the driveway, but the door was ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. His briefcase was in the passenger seat. But where was he? Emily froze for a moment, just standing there, the realization dawning on her. This wasn't just out of character, this was wrong. She reached out to close the door, but before she could, something caught her eye. His jacket, one of his favorites, a dark wool coat, was draped across the seat, as if he'd been in a rush to get somewhere. But still, there was no sign of him. Her instincts screamed at her, a chill creeping down her spine. She stepped back from the car, the cold night air biting at her skin. What had happened to him? It was only when she stepped back into the living room that her panic truly set in. Andrew's wallet was still on the coffee table, his phone charging in the kitchen just where he had left it. His keys were on the counter. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been touched. Emily's breath quickened as her thoughts raced. He wouldn't just leave without his wallet, without his phone, without telling her something. Something was wrong. Her thoughts were a blur as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling. Within minutes, the police were at the house. They arrived quickly, probably too quickly for a case that seemed to be no more than a missing persons report at the time. But Emily could feel the tension rising as the officers examined the scene. Detective Sarah Mitchell was one of the first on the scene, her calm presence a stark contrast to the palpable fear that was growing in the room. Sarah had seen cases like this before, too many to count, people disappearing, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. But something in her gut told her that this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. Not by a long shot. She immediately began questioning Emily, her voice soft but direct, looking for any clue, any small detail that might have been overlooked. Emily's responses were frantic, full of anxiety and confusion, but they were consistent. Andrew had left the house as usual, gone to work, and made plans to meet friends for dinner. She hadn't heard from him since. The first searches were conducted immediately. Sarah and the officers began canvassing the area, asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. No one had. No one had heard a car screeching away. No cries for help, nothing. It was as if Andrew Hayes had simply vanished into thin air. As they continued searching, one officer came forward with a lead. A neighbor had reported seeing Andrew's car parked by the side of the road earlier in the evening. They hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed significant. Back at the police station, Detective Mitchell looked over the initial reports. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious foul play, and no witnesses. Everything was too quiet, the type of quiet that seemed to swallow the truth. Sarah's brow furrowed as she sifted through the details. The neighbor's sighting, Andrew's missing briefcase, his left-behind personal items. Something about all of it felt wrong. And then, the breakthrough came. CCTV footage from a nearby coffee shop. It wasn't much, just a snippet of Andrew walking down the street at around 8 p.m., the time when he was last seen. He was alone, walking with a slight urgency like he had somewhere to be, but then he vanished. The footage showed Andrew turning into a dark alleyway, but then the cameras cut out. The dark alley, the place where Andrew had disappeared without a trace, was now a key focus of the investigation. The alley itself was narrow, almost claustrophobic, with graffiti-covered walls that seemed to close in on you from either side. There were no witnesses. No one had heard anything, and yet Andrew Hayes had vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the very town he had lived in for years. Detective Mitchell sat at her desk reviewing the footage again. There was nothing more she could see, nothing that made sense. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, trying to piece together the puzzle. Why had Andrew gone into that alley? Who could have followed him? Was there anyone watching him? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but in her gut she knew. Something was wrong. Someone was hiding something. As the night wore on, the police conducted house-to-house searches, but by the time the early hours of the morning rolled around, there was still no sign of Andrew. His disappearance had become a riddle, one that no one could solve. His wife was in tears, the police were left scratching their heads, and the town of Grimwood, once so peaceful, now felt like a place of unease. The first signs of a deeper mystery were beginning to surface, but they were still too faint to see clearly. What had happened to Andrew Hayes? And why, after all these years of keeping his past buried, had it come back to haunt him now? The clock was ticking. and with each passing hour the trail grew colder. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small room where Detective Sarah Mitchell sat, her eyes glued to the stack of files in front of her. She could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her. Something about Andrew Hayes' disappearance felt off. The mystery was thickening, every new lead raising more questions than answers. She ran a hand through her hair and exhaled deeply. She wasn't used to this, being stuck, unable to move forward. Usually the answers came to her piece by piece, but this one was different. Andrew Hayes had disappeared and no one could explain why. A light knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Mitchell, softly. "Come in." The door creaked open and Officer James Novak stepped inside, holding a folder in his hand. He looked just as weary as Sarah felt, but he had something. Something she needed. "Officer Novak. Got the latest on Hayes. Thought you'd want to see this." He handed her the folder and she opened it without hesitation. Inside, she found a series of interviews with Andrew's family, friends, and colleagues, along with a set of photographs from the crime scene and CCTV footage. Sarah flipped through the pages quickly, her mind already racing. The investigation had begun with Emily Hayes, of course, the one person who knew Andrew best. Sarah had spoken to her earlier, but the conversation had left her with more questions than answers. Emily had been honest, but the more Sarah learned about their life together, the more she wondered what Emily wasn't telling her. Emily, speaking quietly, "He'd been anxious, you know, more than usual, but he'd always brushed it off. Never let me in." Detective Mitchell, focused. "Did he ever mention someone from his past? Anyone he was worried about?" Emily hesitated for a long time before answering. It wasn't the answer Sarah was expecting. Emily, shaken. "He did. A few days before he disappeared, he got a message. I didn't know what it was about at the time, but..." He looked terrified. "He didn't tell me who it was from, but I know it was someone he didn't want to see." The details were troubling, but not enough to form any real leads. Still, something about Andrew's behavior had changed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Sarah knew that hidden connections lay beneath the surface, connections that might explain Andrew's sudden fear, his strange behavior. Sarah set the file down and picked up the phone. It was time to dig deeper. She had a feeling that Andrew's past was going to be the key to unraveling this whole case. The next day, Sarah found herself walking the quiet streets of Grimwood. The fog had lifted, but the unease lingered, hanging like a mist in the air. She passed by Andrew's office building and stopped for a moment, looking up at the windows. She could see his desk from here, the same one he'd sat at every day, surrounded by papers, always working, always buried in something. And yet, despite the normalcy of it all, he had disappeared without a trace. As Sarah walked toward the building, her mind began to race with thoughts of what she had learned about Andrew's past. The secrets he had kept hidden from everyone, even his wife. But there was one thing Sarah had to confirm before she could piece everything together: the connection to Tom Granger. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. Andrew's co-workers had already been questioned. Some had said they hadn't seen anything unusual, while others mentioned that Andrew had become increasingly paranoid in the days leading up to his disappearance. Sarah approached the receptionist, a young woman named Megan who had worked with Andrew for several years. Megan seemed nervous as Sarah introduced herself. "Detective Mitchell. Ms. Patel, I need you to tell me about Andrew's behavior in the weeks before he disappeared." Megan, fidgeting, hesitant. He was different. More irritable, distracted. I don't know if he was just tired or if something else was going on, but there was one thing that stuck with me. Sarah leaned in, her attention sharp. "Detective Mitchell, What was it? Megan, quietly. He kept looking over his shoulder. At first I thought he was just being paranoid, but then, one day I saw him talking to someone outside the office. They were standing by the street just talking for a few minutes. He looked frightened. I didn't get a good look at the other person, but he was tall. I think I remember him wearing a black jacket. Sarah stepped out of the building, her thoughts spinning. The more she learned, the more questions piled up. There had to be something, some lead that could connect Andrew to the mystery of his past. Back at the station, Sarah's mind was sharp, focused. She was looking through old records when an officer knocked and entered with a report. Officer Novak. "We've got something new." We ran some checks on Andrew's phone records. He received multiple calls from an unknown number in the weeks before he disappeared. And there's one thing that stands out. One of those calls was made to a Tom Granger, a man who hasn't been heard from in years. The connection was clear now. Tom Granger. Granger was a name from the past, a name that had been buried in the town's history for years. He had disappeared long ago, but his past was far from clean. Granger had been a fugitive involved in a series of unsolved murders, and now, somehow, his name had resurfaced in connection with Andrew's disappearance. Sarah picked up the phone and made the call. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Detective Mitchell, get me everything we have on Tom Granger. I want to know where he is and who he's been in contact with." She set the phone down and turned to the map on the wall. Grimwood was small, but its secrets were large, too large. That evening, Sarah went through Andrew's belongings once more, trying to find any clue that would lead her to the truth. The study was small, cluttered with files and papers. As she rummaged through the desk, something caught her eye. A picture of Andrew with a man she didn't recognize. The man was tall, dark hair, wearing a leather jacket. She could feel the pieces clicking together. The picture had been hidden away, out of sight. Why? And more importantly, who was he? The fog had returned thicker than before, cloaking the town in shadows. Sarah walked back to her car, her mind racing. She knew the case was growing more complicated by the minute. She had a name now, Tom Granger. She had a picture, a clue. But the biggest question remained, what had Andrew gotten himself into? The investigation into Andrew Hayes' disappearance had been relentless, yet frustratingly fruitless. Each step forward seemed to reveal another layer of secrecy, another layer of Andrew's hidden past. But still, the trail was cold. No witnesses, no concrete evidence, just a series of disjointed clues that never quite fit together. And as the days turned into weeks, Detective Sarah Mitchell could feel the pressure mounting. This case was no longer just about a missing person. It had turned into something darker, something more dangerous. And it wasn't just about finding Andrew anymore. It was about finding the truth, the whole truth, no matter how dark it was. As Sarah sat at her desk, sifting through the mountain of files and evidence, she felt the weight of the case settling in. She had interviewed everyone who knew Andrew. She had tracked down the leads, dead ends everyone. She had checked every alibi, every lead that tied back to his past, and still there was no clear answer. Just questions and whispers. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of a contact who might finally offer her the missing piece of the puzzle. On the other end of the line, Officer Novak answered quickly. "Officer Novak, urgent." "Detective, you'll want to see this. We've found something." Sarah's pulse quickened. It was rare for Officer Novak to sound anything but composed. This was different. "Detective Mitchell, steely." "What is it?" Officer Novak, slowly. "It's a storage unit, registered under Andrew Hayes' name. We just got the paperwork. It's been rented for months, but no one knew about it. We went there and, well, you need to see it for yourself." The storage unit was located in a run-down part of town, tucked behind a set of abandoned warehouses. The entire area smelled of rust and decay, a place untouched by time. The yellow police tape marked off the entrance, and several officers stood nearby guarding the site. Sarah arrived with Officer Novak, her mind racing. What could Andrew have been hiding? Why would he rent a storage unit and keep it a secret? As they stepped inside the unit, Sarah was immediately struck by the coldness of the place. There were no windows, only the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The officer handed her a flashlight, and Sarah turned it on, scanning the rows of boxes and old furniture. Then she saw it. At the back of the unit, partially hidden beneath a pile of old blankets and discarded furniture, was a wooden box, old, weathered, and clearly out of place. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She moved forward quickly, kneeling beside it and prying it open with trembling hands. Inside, the box contained a collection of items that made her stomach drop. There were old photographs, their edges curling with age, some faded and others barely recognizable. And then, there was a blood-stained jacket. The fabric was dark, torn at the sleeves, and it looked too familiar. As Sarah examined it closer, her breath caught in her throat. The jacket was connected to the unsolved disappearances from years ago. The very cases that had been haunting Grimwood for decades. The same bloodstains that had once been a mystery were now tied to Andrew. But what did this mean? Who was Andrew hiding from? Why would he keep this jacket, this piece of evidence, hidden for so long? Back at the station, Sarah stared at the photograph she had found in the storage unit. Andrew standing next to a man she didn't recognize at first. The photo was grainy, but the face was unmistakable. Tom Granger, the man whose name had come up in Andrew's investigation, the fugitive connected to a string of unsolved murders. Sarah ran her fingers over the photograph, her mind trying to piece together the puzzle. She flipped it over, and in faded ink, she read the words, "We can't outrun our past, not this time." It was a warning, one Andrew must have taken to heart, and now here she was, staring at the man who had once been a part of his life, a part he had been running from, trying to forget. The past was catching up with Andrew Hayes, and he had left more than just a trail of blood behind him. Sarah knew the time had come. She had to confront Jake Miller, Andrew's old college friend, and the one person who might know something about Andrew's secret life. Jake had been the last to see Andrew, and yet he seemed to be hiding something. Sarah had no time for second-guessing. She needed the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The meeting place was an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found. Jake's car was parked outside, hidden in the shadows. Sarah stepped out of her own car, her flashlight held tight in her hand. The air was thick with the smell of decay and dust. But it wasn't the building that unnerved her. It was the man she was about to face. Jake sat in the corner of the room, his face hidden in the dim light. When Sarah entered, his eyes lifted, meeting hers with a look that was almost defensive. Detective Mitchell, firm. "Jake, I need to know what you know about Andrew. Everything." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching nervously. He wasn't ready to give it up, but Sarah could see the truth written on his face, the guilt, the fear. He was hiding something, and she wasn't going to stop until she had it. "Jake," voice shaky. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. Andrew was my friend. I didn't know anything about what happened." Detective Mitchell, pressing. "Don't lie to me, Jake. The last time you saw him, you both knew something. Why did he disappear?" Jake's eyes darted to the floor. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, I didn't think it would go this far. He didn't deserve this, but he was too deep in. I never thought it would catch up with him like this. Sarah stepped closer, her voice cold. Detective Mitchell, tell me, what did Andrew get involved in? Who was he running from? Jake paused, looking around the room as if the walls might close in on him. Finally, he spoke, the words heavy with regret. Jake, quietly. He was mixed up with Granger. And there were others, people I don't even know. They promised him protection, but Andrew was never going to be free. Not from them. Not from what he did. Back at the station, Sarah pieced it all together. Tom Granger was just the tip of the iceberg. Andrew had been involved with a dangerous network, one that had spread its tendrils deep into the underbelly of Grimwood. The unsolved murders, the disappearances, they were all part of a larger operation. And Andrew had been trapped in it, unable to escape. T Police Station, night. The investigation had taken a turn. The first major twist had shifted everything Sarah Mitchell had believed about Andrew Hayes. The man she thought was an ordinary marketing executive was now tied to a network of criminals, a web of deceit, murder, and betrayal that stretched far beyond Grimwood. As Sarah sat at her desk, piecing together the new information, the cold weight of the case pressed heavily on her. The more she learned, the more she realized how little she actually knew about the people she'd been investigating. Andrew Hayes, the quiet man with the good job and the loving wife, had been running from a past he could never escape. But what about everyone else in his life? Jake Miller, his old friend, what was his involvement? Susan Lark, the local journalist. Why had she been so interested in Andrew? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. She picked it up quickly, her eyes never leaving the files in front of her. Detective Mitchell, urgent. Mitchell here. Officer Novak, on the other end. Detective, we've got something. You'll want to hear this. Sarah arrived at the evidence room where Officer Novak was waiting. He handed her a thick manila folder containing new information about Andrew's connections. It was time to go deeper. Novak handed her the contents of a recent lead, a series of deaths and disappearances that, on the surface, seemed unrelated. But as Sarah sifted through the notes, something clicked. These cases weren't just random, they were connected. And now, they were connected to Andrew. The first clue came from a missing persons report. The name on the report sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Michael Brooks, a man who had disappeared 3 months ago. He had been a local businessman well known in Grimwood. His case had gone cold, but after reviewing the details, Sarah found something strange. Brooks had been in contact with Andrew Hayes just a few weeks before his disappearance. There was a meeting, an odd one, late at night. Andrew had been involved in more than just a marketing job. Brooks had been asking questions about something shady going on in town, something involving illegal activity. Had Andrew been trying to help him? Or had he been trying to protect himself from something darker? Sarah's mind raced as she processed this new information. Could Andrew have known something about Brooks' disappearance? Could he have been involved? Back at the station, Sarah began connecting the dots between Michael Brooks and other unresolved disappearances in Grimwood. Sarah pored over file after file, each case more disturbing than the last. The similarities were undeniable. Victims who had all been questioning something, each one disappearing without a trace. Some had been murdered, their bodies never found. Others had simply vanished as if the town itself had swallowed them whole. Andrew Hayes had somehow been connected to all of them. Sarah pulled out a map of Grimwood, marking locations where these disappearances had occurred. Andrew's office was on the map, the alley he had disappeared into, and now she was starting to see it. A pattern, a connection between Andrew and these crimes. The scene shifts back to Jake Miller. After Sarah's conversation with him, she began to realize that Jake had been hiding something important. He had been involved in Andrew's world far deeper than he'd let on. But what about Susan Lark, the local journalist who had been investigating Andrew's past? Sarah had met Susan earlier and she seemed harmless at first, just a reporter with a nose for a story. But now she was beginning to look like something else entirely. Someone who had been following Andrew's every move, and for what purpose? Sarah walked into Susan Lark's small apartment. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. There was a sense of urgency in the air, like someone had been here recently, but had left in a hurry. Books were scattered across the coffee table, open to pages about local crimes, unsolved disappearances, and Grimwood's criminal underworld. It didn't take long for Sarah to realize that Susan wasn't just interested in Andrew. She was obsessed with him. There were notes, tons of them taped to the walls, a web of connections and strange symbols drawn between them. The more Sarah looked at it, the clearer it became. Susan knew something. She had been digging into Andrew's past, trying to uncover his secrets, but why? Was she after the story? Or was she involved in something darker than just investigative journalism? Susan Lark, surprised, entering. "What are you doing here, detective?" Sarah straightened up, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward Susan. "Detective Mitchell, firm. I think you've been following Andrew's trail for a lot longer than you're letting on, Susan." Susan Lark, defensive. "I'm just doing my job. I'm a journalist. People want to know the truth about Andrew Hayes." Detective Mitchell, cutting her off. "The truth? Or are you hiding something? The questions you've been asking, the people you've been talking to, there's more going on here than just a story. And I think you know exactly what it is." The more Sarah investigated, the more the case began to unravel. She started connecting dots that were once too distant to see clearly. Andrew Hayes wasn't just caught in the middle of a web of crime. He had been deeply involved in it. The more Sarah learned about his history, his relationship with Jake Miller, and his dealings with Tom Granger, the more she understood. Andrew hadn't just been hiding from his past. He had been actively trying to cover it up, even from those closest to him. Sarah's next step was to visit the woods just outside of Grimwood. It was the site of another unsolved disappearance, a case that had been sitting cold for over a decade. Local rumors had always linked the woods to strange happenings, but no one could ever prove anything. Sarah needed to see it for herself. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing longer with every step. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. And then, as if on cue, Sarah found what she was looking for: a small abandoned cabin. It was hidden, tucked away in the depths of the trees, barely visible from the main road. She stepped inside. The place was empty now, but the remnants of something dark lingered in the air. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, missing person reports, murder investigations, and unsolved cases. And there, in the center of the floor, was a blood-stained rag, just like the one found in Andrew's storage unit. The connections were undeniable. Andrew Hayes had been involved in something much bigger than anyone had realized. And now, the walls were closing in. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, poring over the files again. The leads were beginning to overlap, each one building on the other, but the truth was still elusive, still buried beneath layers of lies. And then, just as she was about to give up, she found it. A letter hidden in the back of Andrew's file. The letter was dated just a week before Andrew disappeared. It was from Tom Granger. The contents of the letter were chilling. Granger was threatening Andrew, telling him that his time was running out. The letter ended with a simple message: "You can't hide forever, we'll find you." The night had grown deep and the office lights in the Grimwood police station flickered dimly. casting long shadows against the walls. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over her desk, exhausted but resolute. She had spent weeks piecing together a puzzle that seemed to grow darker by the day. But now, something felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, a weight that hung heavy in the room. She could feel it. The truth was close. The phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the silence of the room. Detective Mitchell, quickly. Mitchell here, Officer Novak, on the other end. Detective, we've found it. The last piece. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly, her eyes scanning the pile of files in front of her. Detective Mitchell, firm. What is it? Officer Novak. We found a video from Andrew. The video was clear, but its contents would change everything. The grainy footage flickered for a moment before Andrew Hayes appeared on the screen. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, looking tired, his face gaunt, his eyes heavy with the weight of something much darker than anyone had imagined. The camera focused on Andrew, his voice low but steady. Andrew, if you're seeing this, then it's too late. Sarah leaned forward, the gravity of the moment settling over her. Andrew, I've been running my whole life, running from who I used to be. I thought I could outrun it, but I was wrong. He paused, his eyes darting to something off camera as if making sure no one was watching. Andrew, I don't know if anyone will ever see this, but if they do, it means I'm dead. The words hit Sarah like a cold wave. Dead? Was this a confession, or was it something more? She could feel the mystery deepening, wrapping tighter around her with each passing second. As Andrew continued speaking in the video, his voice cracked. A glimpse of the man who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Andrew. I was a different person once. I did things, terrible things. The scene shifted, showing flashes of photographs, blood-stained rags, a man's face, and the figure of a young Andrew, standing beside a man who was unmistakably Tom Granger. Andrew. Tom Granger and I, we were both involved in something far darker than either of us understood at the time. We were just kids, we were forced into it. He hesitated again, looking as though the memories were too painful to relive. Andrew. But when I tried to get out, when I tried to leave it all behind, they came for me. They made sure I couldn't escape. The video continued, but now Sarah felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about a missing man. This was about a web of crimes that had been buried under layers of lies, deceit, and fear. And Andrew had been right in the center of it. Andrew. I tried to bury it. I thought if I could start over in Grimwood, I'd be safe, but they found me, and now they'll find me again. They won't stop until I'm dead. The video continued for several minutes, each word making Sarah feel the weight of Andrew's desperation. He was confessing, but at the same time, he was pleading for the truth to be uncovered. This wasn't just a confession of guilt. It was a warning. The scene shifted back to Grimwood, a place that was beginning to feel more like a cage. Sarah stood outside the old woods, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. The fog had returned, thicker than before, but Sarah wasn't afraid. She had no time for fear anymore. She had been chasing this truth for weeks, and now she was standing at the epicenter of it all. The video had made one thing clear. Andrew Hayes had been running from his past, but he wasn't the only one. The network of criminals connected to Tom Granger was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Sarah had a feeling that the final pieces of the puzzle were hidden right here, in Grimwood, in these woods, where bodies had been buried and secrets had festered for far too long. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, the video still playing on her computer screen. Andrew's words echoed in her mind. Andrew. They're still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure I'm not found. She had to make the connection. Sarah had been to the woods before, but now everything made sense. The storage unit, the blood-stained jacket, the unsolved disappearances, they were all tied together. The deeper Sarah ventured into the woods, the more the past seemed to come alive around her. The memories, the faces, the names, Tom Granger, Michael Brooks, Jake Miller, and even Susan Lark, they were all part of a larger network. A network that had existed in the shadows for years, and now it was all coming to light. As Sarah reached the abandoned cabin, she felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. She was no longer just a detective searching for a missing person. She was hunting a criminal syndicate, a group of people who had been running the town from the shadows for far too long. Inside the cabin, the walls were covered with old newspaper clippings, the yellowed pages detailing unsolved murders, disappearances, and suspicious deaths that had been overlooked for years. It was all starting to make sense now. The people who had disappeared weren't just random. They were part of a much larger operation, and Andrew Hayes had been caught in the crossfire. She examined the walls carefully, reading through the clippings. Each story seemed to be connected, a thread leading to a larger truth. Then she found it, the final piece of the puzzle. A letter addressed to Andrew from Tom Granger. "You've made a mistake, Andrew. You can't leave, you can't escape, you're part of this now, and there's no way out. You're either with us or you're against us, and if you're against us, well, we know what happens to people who try to run." The letter was signed with the simple, chilling phrase, "We own you." Sarah stood still in the darkness of the woods, her breath heavy in the cold air. The truth was clearer than ever. Andrew Hayes had been hiding in plain sight, trying to escape a past that had never truly let him go. As she turned to leave, a figure appeared in the distance, silhouetted by the fog. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Jake Miller. The fog clung to the ground like a ghost, swirling around Sarah's feet as she stood frozen in place. Jake Miller was standing a few feet away, his figure barely visible in the dim light of her flashlight. His face was twisted in something that could have been either guilt or fear. It was hard to tell. His presence in the woods at this hour didn't make sense. He hadn't been a part of the investigation, not directly. He had been Andrew's best friend, but it was clear now that Jake was more deeply involved in the web of lies, secrets, and criminal activities than Sarah had realized. The truth was beginning to unfold, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a trap. Detective Mitchell, steady. "Jake, I should have known." Jake didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, the fog swallowing his movements, but his voice was clear, a mixture of regret and something darker. "Jake," softly. "You think you know everything, Sarah. You don't. You can't just peel back the layers and expect everything to make sense. Some things are meant to stay buried." Detective Mitchell, firm. "Andrew didn't just disappear, did he? You were part of this, weren't you?" Jake's shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like the guilt was consuming him. But then his eyes narrowed, and there was a coldness that hadn't been there before. Jake, calm, but shaking. Andrew was part of something much bigger. He didn't want to be. He tried to run, but you know what they say. Once you're in, you can never get out. Flashback. Andrew and Jake's past. As Jake spoke, Sarah's mind drifted back to the conversation she'd had with him earlier in the investigation. The cracks in Jake's story were growing wider. It all made sense now, the unease in Jake's eyes, the evasiveness in his responses. He had been hiding the truth. And the more Sarah thought about it, the clearer it became. Andrew's disappearance was not just about running from a dangerous past. It was about trying to escape the web of lies and criminal ties that had controlled his life for years. Jake had been a part of it. He had protected Andrew until the very end. But now, The truth was coming out. Jake had always been involved. He just didn't want to admit it. He had stayed silent, pretending to be the innocent friend, but he was just as much a part of this as Tom Granger and the others. Sarah's flashlight flickered as the silence stretched between them. Detective Mitchell, steely yet calm. Jake, it's over. You can't protect him anymore. You can't protect yourself either. Jake clenched his jaw. He had lied, but now the truth was too clear to ignore. Jake, quietly, almost to himself, you don't understand. You don't know what it's like to be trapped in a place like this. I tried to help Andrew. I tried to keep him out of it. But there's no way out. There's no escape from the people he was dealing with. Hours later, Sarah sat in the interrogation room staring at the file in front of her. Jake had finally confessed. He had been part of the network of criminals that had used Grimwood as a hub for illegal activities. He had been involved in the cover-ups, the disappearances, the lies that had kept Grimwood's dark side hidden from the rest of the world. But as Jake spoke, it became clear that there was something even more dangerous at play. Andrew had gotten too close to the truth. He had learned too much, and he had tried to break free, tried to expose the truth. But there were always people ready to make sure that never happened. And now, Jake's confession was the final nail in the coffin. The network that Andrew had been trying to escape had been brought to light. The scene shifted to a memory of the night Andrew disappeared. Andrew had called Jake the night before he vanished. The conversation had been tense, filled with the kind of fear that Sarah had heard in Andrew's video confession. Andrew had warned Jake that he was being followed, that people were watching him. But Jake hadn't taken him seriously, at least not until it was too late. Sarah sat in the dim light of the interrogation room, the walls closing in around her. She felt like she was missing something vital that would make all of this make sense. She reviewed the case files again, the unanswered questions from the start. Why had Andrew chosen to come back to Grimwood? Was it really just to escape his past, or was there something more? Had Andrew known too much? It wasn't until Sarah opened a locked drawer in Andrew's desk, one she hadn't thought to check before, that the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. In the drawer was a final letter. It was written by Andrew himself, addressed to Emily. It was clear, direct, and chilling. Emily, I'm sorry, I don't know how to explain this, but you need to understand there are people who want to silence me. People I can never escape. I've been trying to run, but they know where I am. I don't know how much longer I can hide. If I disappear, I need you to know I did it to protect you. I love you, but I can't come back. Please. Tell them the truth. The truth. Andrew had known. He had been trying to expose something far darker than anyone could imagine. He had tried to run, but in the end he had been betrayed by the people he trusted the most. Sarah stepped out of the police station, the night air cool against her skin. Grimwood felt different now. Darker, almost suffocating. She had uncovered the truth, but it didn't feel like a victory. Andrew Hayes was a man trapped by his own past. A man who tried to break free from a criminal network that controlled the town. And in the end, that network had destroyed him, just as it had destroyed so many others. But there was something else, a nagging feeling that wouldn't let Sarah go. The case was solved, but the truth still felt incomplete. There were more people involved, more secrets buried beneath the surface, and Sarah knew this wouldn't be the last time she would hear about Grimwood's dark side. As Sarah walked down the foggy streets, the mystery of Grimwood was far from over. The truth might have come to light, but the shadows would always linger, waiting for the next chapter of this twisted tale to unfold. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with friends who love a good mystery. And hey, comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Where do you think this story is headed next? And what was your favorite part of the mystery? Also, let us know. Where are you watching from? How did this story impact you? Your comments mean the world to us. And remember, if you want to hear more gripping tales like this, subscribe to our channel and we'll bring you even more twists, turns, and unforgettable stories. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp.